So unfortunately, my favorite local cider mill was closed this year, but that wasn't going to stop me from enjoying one of my favorite fall treats. All this meant was that I was going to have to take matters into my own hands. So I've made a lot of donuts over the past few weeks, and I've finally come up with what I believe is the perfect apple cider donut. So let's get into it. If you're new here, my name is Charlie, and on this channel I explore the basic principles of cooking so that we can all become better home cooks. So let's make some donuts. And we're first going to combine all of the dry ingredients, starting with 315 grams or about 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. And this will be enough for about 10 small to medium-sized donuts, so feel free to scale the recipe as you see fit. Now these are going to be cake donuts, meaning that their leavening won't come from yeast, but instead it'll come from baking powder and baking soda. I did try yeasted donuts during my testing of this recipe, but I found that for the most classic apple cider donuts, they definitely need to be cake donuts. So next we're just going to add about 1/2 teaspoon of kosher salt, and keep in mind that if you're using table salt, you'll only want to use about 1/4 teaspoon, followed by 2 teaspoons of baking powder and 1 teaspoon of baking soda. Then to start to incorporate our spices, we'll add 1 tablespoon of ground cinnamon along with 2 tablespoons of freshly grated nutmeg. If you're using pre-ground nutmeg, you'll only want to use about 1 tablespoon, but I'd highly recommend using freshly grated nutmeg if you can. Whole nutmeg should be easy to find at your local grocery store, and the flavor difference is night and day compared to the pre-ground stuff. And the nutmeg is what gives these cake donuts their signature flavor, so it's especially important in this recipe to use the highest quality possible. So in this case, I'm just using my microplane to grate 1 whole nut of nutmeg, which will give me exactly the 2 tablespoons that I need. Then that's it for the dry ingredients, so just whisk those together until homogeneous, and set that bowl aside for the time being as we prepare our wet ingredients. Now for these, the first thing we're going to do is get out a large pan and melt 2.5 tablespoons of butter over medium-high heat. I'd also recommend browning the butter for the complex nutty flavor that it provides, but that step is technically optional. Either way, keep your pan on the heat and add 3/4 cup of fresh apple cider, which we're going to reduce in order to concentrate the apple flavor. Now I also like to add 1 cinnamon stick here, broken up into a few pieces to infuse some extra cinnamon flavor into the cider. Then just let that cook down to about 1/4 cup, and at that point you should be left with a thin syrupy liquid, which you'll want to transfer to a separate bowl. Then to that bowl, slowly whisk in 1/2 cup or about 121 grams of buttermilk, along with 1/2 tablespoon of vanilla extract. Then again, just set that bowl aside for now as we prepare the final ingredients. Now for this part, I'd highly recommend using a stand mixer if you have one, but as always, this can also be done by hand. But assuming you're using a stand mixer, beat 1 egg using the paddle attachment, and you may need to lift up the bowl like so if the paddle doesn't quite reach. Then add 125 grams or about 5/8 cup of granulated sugar, and continue to beat that mixture until it becomes aerated and turns a very light yellow color. Then go ahead and add your buttermilk and cider mixture and continue stirring until completely combined. Now finally, it's time to add back the dry ingredients, so pour them in a little bit at a time, making sure that they're fully incorporated before each new addition. Then once all of the dry ingredients are incorporated, just continue mixing on a low speed for about 1 to 2 more minutes to develop some gluten in the dough. By that point, the dough should become firm, but it'll still be somewhat sticky. So in order to make the dough easier to handle, we're going to allow it to rest for 25 to 30 minutes, preferably in the refrigerator, which will help it to become a lot less sticky. Now in the meantime, this is a good opportunity to prepare our cinnamon sugar topping, which we'll use to coat the donuts after we've fried them. So for this, just combine 1/2 cup or about 96 grams of sugar with 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, which is a 12-to-1 ratio. Now obviously I added a lot more than 2 teaspoons of cinnamon here, but in hindsight I realized that less is actually better because there's already plenty of cinnamon in the dough, and the excess cinnamon on the surface just tends to clump up and become soggy. So because of that, I'd recommend going with the 12-to-1 ratio. Anyways, before your dough is done resting, you'll also want to start heating up your oil for frying. Now you only need your oil to be about 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep in order to fry these donuts, so I actually like to just use a cast iron skillet, but you could also use a Dutch oven or other deeper pot if you prefer. And as always for frying, you'll want to use a neutral high smoke point oil, and personally I prefer to use peanut oil. So just slowly let that oil heat up to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 180 degrees Celsius. Then after the dough is done resting, it's time to roll it out and start forming our donuts. So the dough should be a lot less sticky than before, but it will still be slightly tacky, so be sure to use plenty of flour on your work surface. So turn the dough out onto your floured surface and roll it to about 1/2 inch thick. Then punch out your donuts using a donut cutter or a round cookie cutter, or if you don't have either of those, you could even use a mug or a cup to cut them out. But these donut cutters are pretty cheap and they do make it a lot easier. Then as you punch the donuts out, place them onto a generously floured baking tray, and if you want to make classic whole donuts, use a smaller donut cutter to punch out the center pieces, which you can also fry up to make donut holes. So once that's all done and your oil is heated to around 350 degrees Fahrenheit, carefully drop in a few donuts at a time, being careful not to overcrowd the pot. They will sink at first, but then start to float after just a few seconds as they start to puff up a bit. So try to maintain your oil between 325 degrees and 350 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the entire process, and once the first side becomes a light golden brown color, which should only take about a minute, flip the donuts and continue frying until the second side is golden brown as well. And when they're finished frying, just transfer them to a wire rack to cool. As you take them out, you should see the cracks and crevices that have formed on the surface, which is characteristic of a cake-style donut, so that's definitely what we're looking for. Now while the donuts are still slightly warm, toss them in your cinnamon sugar mixture, being sure to coat them completely. It's important to do this while the donuts are still warm because the sugar actually needs to melt a bit in order to stick properly. But you don't want to coat them right out of the fryer because that way you'll just end up with a soggy, clumpy coating, so make sure to at least let them cool slightly. Anyways, once they're coated in cinnamon sugar, just return them to your wire rack and repeat that process with the rest of the donuts. And don't forget about the donut holes too. And as always, when you're done frying, you can save your oil by just straining it out into a jar and reusing it for your next batch of donuts. These donuts are best when served fresh, but they're still great even up to a few days later, especially when heated before serving. So now that you know how to make apple cider donuts, if you want to learn how to make some more seasonal recipes, be sure to click that playlist in the bottom right corner of the screen. So there you go. I'll see you all in the next one.